There is little dispute that Jesus was born just over 2,000 years ago. However, a point of contention exists as to Jesus' life before coming to the earth. Some believe that Jesus has always existed, whereas others, including Jehovah's Witnesses, believe that he is a created being. Critics accuse the New World Translation of being biased in its translation of key passages relating to Jesus and him having a beginning. This video presentation will look at these verses to show that the New World Translation is accurate and show that the Bible and additional evidence confirms Jesus as being created. This highly controversial question of whether or not Jesus is created has been a point of argument between theologians for centuries. In reviewing the biblical evidence, we'll look at Jesus as God's wisdom, Jesus being the beginning of the creation of God, and what it means for Jesus to be the firstborn of creation. This video will include a defense for many objections used against these verses in an effort to disprove Jesus being a created being. King Solomon, who wrote Proverbs chapter 8, speaks of wisdom and contains many personified descriptions of wisdom being a master worker and being there during the physical creation with Jehovah. In verse 22, wisdom is described as being produced as the beginning of Jehovah's way. Jehovah's Witnesses contend that wisdom here is in fact Jesus, and hence that Jesus had a beginning. However, there are some objections to this understanding that we shall examine. The first is that wisdom isn't Jesus, it's only a quality of Jehovah. However, the obvious problem with this is it implies that there was a time that Jehovah was lacking in wisdom. There is no biblical evidence for this, quite the opposite, as Jehovah is described in terms as being an all-knowing and all-wise God. The second objection is how different translations render this verse. Some use created, whereas others use the term possessed, as if Christ as wisdom was merely there at the beginning instead of being created. So should it be possessed or created? The Hebrew word used is kana, which according to dictionaries can mean to get, acquire, create, buy, or possess. In the Bible it is used to refer to a person that is acquired, and came to be in possession of the parent or creator by being born, created, or bought. However, the problem with this argument is that previous to being possessed, the person or thing was not possessed by the creator, parent, or buyer. Thorough analysis of the biblical use of the word kana was conducted by the Oxford biblical scholar Charles Burney, who said, "The verb kana always seemed to possess the sense get, acquire, never the sense possess, own, simply, apart from the idea of possessing something, which has been acquired in one way or another. The idea of creation is closely connected with the idea of acquisition as being one form of it." In fact, the Greek Septuagint, which was the first translation made of the Hebrew Scriptures, finished around the 1st century BCE and was made using manuscripts older than the ones we use today, and was made by scholars with a knowledge of Hebrew and Koine Greek, uses the Greek word ektize in Proverbs chapter 8 verse 22, from the verb ktizo, which according to Vine's dictionary was used biblically meaning to create, either of the natural creation or the spiritual creation. Clearly, this adds a lot of weight to the argument that Proverbs chapter 8 verse 22 is referring to Christ as a created being. The third objection is that many translations describe wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8 and 9 as a she, which would seem inappropriate for Jesus being a male Messiah. Whilst this may sound convincing, it needs to be noted that nouns are gendered in a lot of languages, including Hebrew and Greek, and Jesus refers to himself as being a rock to Peter in Matthew chapter 16 verse 18, and rock here is in the feminine. This is just one example of many, so this argument of gender is of no weight against Jesus being identified as created wisdom. There is also the commentary from a number of the early church fathers who identified Jesus as being the wisdom from Proverbs. Justin Martyr was an early Christian philosopher and apologist born in 100 AD in Judea. He wrote multiple letters, many of which were attempts to stop the persecution of Christians at the hands of the Romans. One of his works was titled A Dialogue with Trypho, a letter he wrote to prove the messiahship of Jesus. In there he makes multiple links between Jesus and the wisdom mentioned in the Proverbs. A link to the text of his entire letter is in the description. Similarly, born in Rome just over 50 years later than the birth of Justin Martyr was Tertullian. He was an early apologist and a prolific writer who wrote against the teaching of Christian Gnostics. In two of his works, Against Praxeas and Against Hermogenes, he calls out Jesus as being created wisdom. Another early church father of note is that of Origen. He was one of, if not the most prolific writer of the early church fathers, due to having a team of secretaries to copy his works. It's thought he was born in Egypt, and in several of his works identifies the son with wisdom described in the Proverbs. For instance, in his On First Principles and his commentary on John, both make quotations from Proverbs chapter 8, attributing wisdom as Jesus. Similarly, in his apologetic work Against Celsus, who was a pagan philosopher, Origen describes Jesus as being created wisdom. Next, born in the 3rd century was the bishop of Carthage, Cyprian. In his writings he identified Jesus as being the firstborn and wisdom of God, just before quoting Solomon's words from Proverbs chapter 8. Then there is a Christian author and advisor to Roman Emperor Constantine I, called Lactantius. Viewed as his most important work, the Divine Institutes was aimed at proving the reasonableness of Christianity to pagan critics. In there he calls out the Son of God as being identified by the quote from Proverbs chapter 8, that of wisdom. More recently, an analysis performed by Professor John Patrick of the writings of Clement, who was a Christian theologian and philosopher who lived between 150 to 215 AD, says, Clement repeatedly identifies the Word with the wisdom of God, and yet he refers to wisdom as the first created of God, while in one passage he attaches the epithet first created, and in another first begotten, to the Word. But this seems to be rather a question of language than a question of doctrine. At a later date, a sharp distinction was drawn between first created and firstborn or first begotten, but no such distinction was drawn in the time of Clement, who with the Septuagint rendering of a passage in Proverbs before him, could have had no misgivings as to the use of these terms. The final two people we'll consider were the two predominant interlocutors at the Council of Nicaea. The first one was Arius, who argued for Christ being subordinate under the Father, and for part of his argumentation he used Proverbs chapter 8 verse 22 to back up his point. His opponent, Athanasius, was a staunch advocate of Trinitarianism, who disputed that Jesus was created. However, he never denied that the wisdom in the Proverbs was Jesus. Whilst the following author wouldn't agree with Jehovah's Witnesses on their view of Jesus, Maurice Dowling nevertheless states, 4th century readers generally accepted without question that the personal language of the Proverbs passage indicated a divine person, and that since Christ was the wisdom of God, as explicitly stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 24, it was obviously Christ that the passage was describing. Indeed, the case in terms of the language used and in the understanding of the early church fathers is that of Jesus having a beginning and being wisdom in the Proverbs. Hence, this is far from an invention by Jehovah's Witnesses, nor is it a peculiarity of the New World Translation. Containing powerful imagery, the book of Revelation is the last book of the Bible. Written by John whilst in exile on the island of Patmos, it is well known for its visions, symbolisms, and vivid descriptions concerning the upcoming apocalypse. The first few chapters of Revelation, John writes messages to 7 Christian congregations in Asia, and to the community in Laodicea he includes descriptions of Jesus. In Revelation chapter 3 and verse 14, one of those terms used to describe Jesus is the beginning of creation, and the New World Translation includes a reference linking the verse to Proverbs chapter 8 and verse 22, which, as we've just seen, discusses the creation of wisdom. The case being made quite clearly is that Jesus as the beginning of creation means he is not only created, but the very first member of creation. This creates a clear distinction between the uncreated God Jehovah, the Father, and Jesus the first created being. However, the main objection that critics make to this translation as Jesus being the beginning of the creation is that this is not the correct translation, as many translations do not use beginning, but instead use the terms ruler, source, or origin of creation. Using terms like origin of creation implies that Jesus is the source of all creation, and ruler meaning he is ruling over creation. Both are very different to Jesus being the first member of creation. Before doing any analysis of the Greek, it does first need to be noted that many Bible translations do use the rendering beginning of creation. It is far from a peculiarity of the New World Translation. In fact, in a survey of 47 Bible translations, 22 use beginning. The Greek word used is arche, and it's used dozens of times in the Bible. It does need to be noted that arche can be translated as ruler, as is shown by dictionaries. However, the question that needs answering is how did John use the term arche? Well, John, who wrote Revelation, uses the word arche 21 times in his biblical writings. As is obvious, each time it carries the connotation of beginning and not origin or ruler, and is translated the same way in the King James, as shown here, and other translations as beginning. For instance, John chapter 2 verse 11, referring to the miracle Jesus performed at a wedding, says, "the beginning of miracles," clearly means the first of Jesus' miracles, not the source or ruler of miracles. Similarly, later on in the first letter of John, talking of the devil in chapter 3 and verse 8, it says that he has been sinning since the beginning. If it was translated as sinning since the origin or ruler, that simply wouldn't make any sense. John is consistent in his use of arche, as it always means beginning. In addition, when John wanted to use the word ruler, he used the Greek word archon, not arche. And John uses archon as ruler 5 times, 4 times in the Gospel of John, and then once in the book of Revelation. The most pertinent use of archon is in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5, where he applies this to Jesus as ruler, and it's notable that instead of repeating this use of archon 2 chapters later, he instead chose to use a different word, arche. So the evidence that Revelation refers to Jesus having a beginning, and hence being a created being, is strong, based on the use of John's consistent use of arche to mean beginning, which he assigns to Jesus in regards to the creation, and how he uses archon to mean ruler. The biblical account of Jacob and Esau well illustrates the role in ancient Jewish custom of the firstborn, who was the one born first, the beginning of his father's procreative power. This one had primogeniture status, which was an honoured position in the family, one that came with inheritance rights. Jacob and Esau were the sons of Isaac and Rebekah. Esau was the elder and first in line, hence he was the firstborn, and would have received the inheritance from Isaac. However, he sold his right as firstborn to Jacob in exchange for a meal, and as such lost out on those rights and the inheritance and blessings from Isaac that came along with it. In Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, Jesus is referred to as being the firstborn of all creation. Following on from what the Bible says about the firstborn, the natural reading is that Jesus is the eldest or first in line, and that he is of creation, hence a part of creation, inescapably meaning he had a beginning. However, there are objections which are raised against this reading. For instance, some suggest that firstborn means preeminent over, or person with authority or status over others, rather than the one literally born first. And the wording of Jesus being firstborn over instead of firstborn of is used in some Bible translations. Critics will then go on to cite examples in the Bible which they claim backs this up. We shall look at some of these. However, before we do, it needs to be noted that the Greek word used for firstborn is prototokos, and it appears over 100 times in the New Testament and Greek Septuagint. Overwhelmingly, there is no contention this is used to mean first in line, or first one that has come into existence in time order, before the rest of his brothers, or similar in the case of an ox or other animal. Now we'll look at the examples used most frequently by critics to provide support for firstborn meaning preeminent status rather than first in line. The most common one used is in Psalms 89 verse 27, which says, "And I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth." This is speaking of King David, and the argument critics use here is that David is not a firstborn, and that firstborn means highest of the kings, as is stated in the verse. It is true that David was not the first one born of his father Jesse, as Jesse's firstborn son was Eliab. It is also true that David was not the first king of Israel, this was King Saul. However, there are a number of problems with this argument. The first is that this position of firstborn is made or given as an appointment. In Colossians, Jesus is never said to be given the position of firstborn of all creation. Hence, he is literally the firstborn of all creation. Secondly, it has been argued that the addition of highest of the kings doesn't change the meaning of the word firstborn here, but merely shows the result of being the firstborn. As an example, think of the word Hollywood, a place known throughout the world. We may associate that word with glamorous celebrities living a flashy lifestyle, but the definition of the word Hollywood is a place in Los Angeles, the center of the American film industry. In a similar way, Jesus being the firstborn of all creation certainly would carry the connotations of him being preeminent of creation, but this wouldn't take away from the initial meaning of Jesus being the literal firstborn of creation. The third problem is that even though the position of firstborn was given, it doesn't negate the fact that David was still a king. The highest of the kings is still a king. Certainly, it wouldn't make sense for David to be preeminent over the other kings. He never ruled or had authority over them in any way. The comparison to Jesus is obvious. Indeed, as scholar Jason Badun says, over in no way can be derived from the Greek genitive article meaning of. Translators make this addition on the basis of doctrine rather than language, whereas of appears to make Jesus part of creation, over sets him apart from it. So if David wasn't the firstborn of Jesse or the first king of Israel, in what sense could David be the firstborn of anything? Whilst this is not made explicit in the scriptures, there are a couple of obvious possibilities, and we shall examine one now. That is that the first king of Israel was King Saul, who started off as a good king. He won military victories and attributed the successes to God, but then later became sinful and was rejected by God. Saul had his rule taken off him, and instead it was given to David, who, although made mistakes, was the first king to die faithful to God. Hence David could be described as the firstborn in that he was the first king of Israel to die faithfully. Indeed, it cannot mean that David is preeminent over the other kings who lived after he died. Also, Jesus was a king in David's line, and certainly no one would suggest that David was preeminent or in authority over Jesus. The second example commonly used by critics to try and advocate the meaning of preeminent over is in Exodus, where the nation of Israel is referred to as God's son, his firstborn. The argument used by critics is that the nation of Israel was not the first nation. However, this argument is easy to refute. The scripture says that the nation was God's firstborn. The nation of Israel was the first nation that God produced, his first nation. It had a beginning. It certainly wasn't in authority or preeminent over all other nations. In all ways, neither of these examples give support to the idea that firstborn means preeminent over or is without a beginning. In addition to this, neither use the term firstborn of, so do nothing to negate the fact that Jesus is referred to as being of creation. Indeed, the Bible uses the term firstborn of over 30 times. In every occasion, the one who is being described as the firstborn belongs to the group. So the firstborn of the sons of Israel is from the sons of Israel, and the firstborn of an ox would be the eldest ox, and so on. We'll now consider other objections used by critics to Jesus being the firstborn of creation. One is that firstborn doesn't mean first created, that there's a difference between being born and created, and that there is a word which means first created, protoktistos, that could have been used by Paul to show Jesus was created. At first glance, these arguments seem strong. But how does the Bible show it to be false? The Bible uses family and birth terms in a non-literal way frequently. For instance, in the 90th Psalm, Moses wrote in the second verse that the mountains and earth were born. Of course, nobody would assume this meant they were literally born like a baby. Another example is in the Areopagus when Paul was reasoning with men in Athens. He quotes their poets as saying that we are God's children, and then goes on to use the terms himself. Of course, human beings are not literally born from God. There are plenty of other examples which show the Bible's use of family and birth terms in a non-literal way. However, why didn't Paul use protoktistos, first created, at Colossians chapter 1 verse 15, and instead use prototokos, firstborn? As has already been highlighted in this video presentation, the term firstborn is used a lot throughout the Bible, and was a well-understood term that was used in the ancient world as referring to the oldest or first in a group, and one that came with responsibilities and rights. But on top of this, there's no evidence the Greek word protoktistos was in common usage during biblical times. It's not used in the Bible, and looking in dictionaries there is no comparatively early uses. So when was it used? One of the earliest recorded uses is that by Clement of Alexandria. What or who was he describing? Well, as has been seen, he's referring to the Logos, or Jesus. Indeed, as was quoted earlier in the segment on the early church fathers and wisdom, John Patrick says, Clement repeatedly identifies the Word with the wisdom of God, and yet he refers to wisdom as the first created of God, while in one passage he attaches the epithet first created, and in another, first begotten, to the Word. Critics also point to the context in Colossians chapter 1 to say that Jesus created all things, which therefore rules out Jesus being created. However, is this really the case? At first look it would seem so. However, on closer inspection we can see what the Bible is really saying about Jesus' role in creation. The inclusion of the word other has already been covered in another video on this channel. The text says that all things were created by him and through him. If someone told you that a message was sent by Peter, you would assume that Peter sent the message. However, this is not the case here. When using the Greek on for by and dia as through, this would mean that Jesus is an agent and not the ultimate source of creation. This concept is well illustrated in John chapter 1 verse 17, that the law, whilst it came from God, it was given through or by means of Moses. Indeed, the King James Version here uses the word by, although it was not meant to mean that Moses was ever the originator of the law. And in the same way with Jesus and creation in Colossians chapter 1, all things created through or by means of Jesus Christ, as is well rendered in the New World Translation, making Jesus' role as the agent in the creation clear. An additional scripture that critics have tried to use to prove Jesus was not created is from John chapter 1 verse 3. In some translations this reads that through Jesus all things were made, and without Jesus nothing was made that was made. The use of language of through as in Colossians chapter 1 also applies. However, the last part, that Jesus made everything that was made. If this is true, then surely Jesus cannot himself be made, if he made everything that was made. However, as we shall see, the verse is not saying anything like this. So what is it saying? By reviewing different translations, we can see that there are two ways it is generally translated. One, as we have seen, that indicated Jesus cannot be made, as he made everything that was made. And other translations do not include that at the end of the sentence of verse 3, but include that as the beginning of the statement in verse 4. So where should those words be? It's notable that the oldest manuscripts do not contain punctuation, and so there's no way to tell from them where those words land. However, by examining poetry and language structure, we can find the most likely answer. Poets have been using beauty and language to evoke meaning for centuries. A popular way this is done is by using a rhyming scheme, where the word at the end of a line will sound similar to the word at the end of a subsequent line. Another popular use of language in poetry is parallelisms. There are many types, and it is where words, phrases, or thoughts are repeated in certain patterns. Indeed, this has been employed in well-known speeches in the modern day, and it was used many times in the Bible. For instance, the Psalms contain many examples, as here in the 18th Psalm by King David, talking about the cords of death, and the grave entangling and coiling around him, and the snares of death and torrents of destruction overwhelming and confronting him. These words and themes are repeated in this poetic structure. John chapter 1 similarly contains a type of this poetic structure in the form of staircase parallelism. Using the text from an interlinear translation, if we arrange it so that we can see the poetic structure and highlight the repeating word patterns, it is quite clear that this translation that leaves "which has come to be" as the start for verse 4 keeps this staircase structure. Indeed, if we try to change it so as to match translations which include "which has come to be" as the end of verse 3, this breaks the staircase parallelism, and the poetic structure is broken. It's perhaps no surprise, therefore, that the older the manuscript, the more these favour that punctuation, and it's not until later, particularly as we get closer to the date for the Nicene Creed in 325 and onwards, that the altered punctuation becomes more popular. The Catholic NAB translation includes a footnote, which is also included on the Vatican website, linked in the video description, which says, "While the oldest manuscripts have no punctuation here, the corrector of Bodmer Papyrus P75, some manuscripts, and the Ante-Nicene Fathers take this phrase with what follows the staircase parallelism. Connection with John chapter 1 verse 3 reflects 4th century anti-Arianism. It is therefore no surprise that considering these two factors, the New World Translation goes with what is clearly the more accurate rendering. Indeed, this is consistent with other texts commenting on Jesus' role in creation, such as 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 6, distinguishing between the role of the Father and the Son, with the Father being the ultimate source of creation, and the Son being the agent or mediator. There is more biblical support for Jesus being created. For instance, in 1 John, Jesus is called God's Son who was sent to the earth, meaning he was called the Son before coming to the earth. A Son always comes into existence after the Father. Additionally, Micah says that Jesus' origins are from old times. Clearly, someone who was created had to have an origin. As Lactantius, one of the early church fathers mentioned previously in this video presentation, says, "For we especially testify that he was twice born, first in the Spirit and afterwards in the flesh."